When I first booted up Undertale and dived into its strange and surreal world, I was captivated by the game constantly instilling and reinforcing within me a sense of unease. In short, I wasn't really sure what was going on, I was straight up befuddled, and this is undeniably a good thing done by design. Your character is a recently deceased child who's been thrown into a weird and unfamiliar underworld where things are tripsy-dipsy, topsy-turvy. You should feel confused, unsure of your surroundings, and suspicious about everything that is happening. In fact, these feelings are crucial to the experience and help make it such an incredible game, because this original sense of unknowing transforms as you play. You slowly start to understand the peculiar mentality of Undertale. The bizarre mechanics that baffled you when you first encounter them start to feel natural and intuitive to use, and eventually you start to feel in control. This is a game cleverly constructed to have your character's emotional journey being mapped onto your journey of figuring out the game. This transient experience is genuinely excellent, but not what I want to talk about. I only want to focus on the unique way Undertale originally creates this distinctive sense of unease from its very first request. Name the fallen human. So how does Undertale achieve this anomalous emotional state? Well, there's a few key ways. Sure, they make the world feel uncommon and unknowable, but the way they weaponize your internalized understanding of gaming against you, the way they construct their own rules only to break them seemingly at random, keeps you on your toes and makes it really hard to identify the psychology of the game and how you should correspondingly approach it. To discuss these major elements that cause the feeling of unease that is paramount for the first few hours of playtime, I'll talk about less abstract areas of the game, such as enemies, combat encounters, relationships, morality systems, and so on, giving examples of how the game employs esoteric systems to these fairly well-established fundamentals of gaming. Let's start with enemies, because one of the most notable things about Undertale is that it has an incredibly unclear and wibbly-wobbly line defining who is friend and who is foe. This is immediately expressed at the beginning of the game when you meet a flower who teaches you combat mechanics. They seem friendly, which of course they do. They're the tutorial NPC easing you into the game. But no, they are an evil betrayer, and the advice they give you is a cruel ploy to actually get yourself hurt. To juxtapose this, a little while later, you stumble across a spider bake sale, something that is decidedly not a thing, and Undertale is the first game where you'll encounter such a concept. In games, spiders are enemies, early game enemies we've all fought a million of. So putting a spider bake sale at the beginning of the game with a friendly sign after you have just been tricked by the flower certainly makes you unsure what to believe. Is this actually a spider bake sale, something I have no familiarity with, or is this some sicko prank and a spider is going to descend from the ceiling and kill me? Well, it's not some sicko prank. The webs let you buy cider and donuts. Obviously, all spider bake sales are customarily filled with cider and donuts. This early game inscrutability towards enemies is capped off with Toriel, a character who guides you through the early part of the game and the first NPC you meet after the flower. She eventually takes you to her house where she is very kindly and seemingly sincerely set up a bedroom to make your stay in this underworld as pleasant as possible. However, there's an odd energy with Toriel. She's certainly kind, but it's hard to discern whether this is legitimate or some sort of ruse where she turns and proves herself to be a wicked witch of sorts. This latter idea is affirmed when you try to leave and she repeatedly stops you before straight up attacking you. Even as this is happening though, it's unclear if she's a villain, and you can even end the fight amicably, which leads to a cutscene where she hugs you and wishes you luck on your journey. This idea that many of the supposed enemies in the game are actually totally fine and not a real threat is reinforced in a bunch of strange ways. There's simple ways like you'll be attacked by enemies but one of them doesn't attack you and is just there, shout out Jerry, all the way to being able to flirt and date bosses. Before we talk about boss dating, let's talk about the game's combat mechanics because they are wild. Much like everything else in the game, they feel familiar, but in reality are something you're likely to have never encountered in a game before. In combat, you have 4 options: fight, act, item, and mercy. 2 of these are pretty self-explanatory, with item more or less working exactly how you think. Fighting, on the other hand, is a scrambled mess of techniques which is likely akin to nothing you've ever seen before, both as far as your attacks work, but certainly how the enemies do. This immediately destabilizes your thinking of small indie RPG turn-based combat, and is a key indication that your experience with past games are not really going to be helpful here in the world of Undertale. Even still, this isn't the most disorienting of combat choices, and fairly quickly you get, oh, this game just has a funky combat system. So let's discuss the two more confusing options, starting with Mercy. Mercy is somewhat simple. You can flee from fights, or if you hurt the enemy enough or build a positive relationship with them, you can spare them. Makes sense. Except, what does it mean to build a positive relationship with an enemy? Well, that's where Act comes into play. Acting allows the players to make a choice to interact with the enemy in a way that isn't fighting, but the options available aren't the same for each enemy, they continuously change. More discombobulating though is the fact that the outcome of what each option actually does is usually entirely unclear. For example, the dog enemies have options such as pet, play, beckon, and so on, which makes these weapon-wielding dog foes less like anamorphic soldiers trying to kill you, but rather makes them seem like, well, dogs, which makes the decision to continuously attack them harder because you probably don't want to kill these somewhat friendly animals, even if they are attacking you. But unless you know exactly what to do with the Act options when you try to pet or play with them, they will still attack you. Although as they do, it feels like there's something here that will get them on your side. Once again, blurring the line between friend and enemy. But not attacking these enemies and sparing them can often be more than a little tricky. This is in large part due to the way that Undertale completely distorts the relationship between cause and effect. Often, one of the huge goals of games is to effectively detail the cause and effect of their mechanics, allowing players to properly interact with the game. If the player does this specific thing, they can expect this specific result. Undertale purposely obfuscates its cause and effect to perpetuate the unease and confusion the player feels when playing the game. And they want you to know that you don't know. They want you to recognize that the game is purposely being shifty with its mechanics and the way it's presenting information. So even though it feels like you can, for example, end a battle with a dog without killing them, it's so unclear how to actually do it. An example of a slight variation of this concept is if you are in combat and use the flutter action on a frog, which is probably the first real enemy you'll fight, you get this response before the frog just continues to attack you. What does this mean? Am I making progress? Did this have any effect at all? Did I just waste a turn? Is it worth trying again? Who knows? And the game certainly isn't going to give you that information. And these responses are great, because if you flattered a frog attacking you in real life, would you really know the effect that action had? Probably not. If you were attacked by a vicious dog, would you know how to defuse the situation? Probably not. We all know there'd be a way to calm the dog down, but in the moment, would you know what to do? And if it's gonna keep attacking you through your attempts to stop the fight, at what point do you give up your pacification venture and just fight back or run? Well, these are the questions Undertale forces you to ask yourself, but as you can expect, it makes trying to assign answers harder than most games. Because it's more than just in-world logic the game plays with, Undertale makes this lack of understanding all the more confusing because the game doesn't follow standard game mechanic rules. For example, if you don't want to fight Toriel and spare her, then surely the spare action would achieve that. No, guess again. What if you do it like 3 times? Classic rules of 3, right? Not gonna work. You need to spare her over and over and over and over again, while also being at less than 3 HP. And the game will throw up 25 unique dialogues as you keep sparing her. This is highly counterintuitive. Doing the same action over and over again, more than 20 times, with no discernible impact or positive result, isn't what we're taught to do. If you do an action a couple times and it fails, then it's probably not the correct solution. But in Undertale, you better buckle in and get ready to press that spare button more than a dozen times. A technique that will only work on this one enemy and is not how you spare many of the other bosses in the game. All of this worked to create a general sense of unknowing. It's consistently unclear if you are doing the right thing. And this doesn't just apply to the mechanics, but also the narrative of the game itself. Early on, it's somewhat apparent there is a morality-based choice system in the game. There are different dialogue choices you make, which may actually make a difference, or may be entirely facadical in their existence. You don't know. Why would you? On top of this, the decision to spare versus fight enemies seems to be at the core of this morality system. But once again, it's incredibly unclear what happens if you spare enemies or whether killing them is even negative. Let's look at Papyrus. Papyrus is one of the early game bosses, a skeleton who hates humans and desperately wants to kill them. A living skeleton who is trying to hunt and kill a human child, who is you, also he can get onto the king's human killing super squad. I mean, pretty clearly a no good baddie. Well, no. Papyrus talks a big game, but as you continue through the world, evading their traps, figuring out their puzzles, they start to warm towards you, and it appears that Papyrus doesn't really want to kill you, as he'll actually let you live at various moments when he could take you out. All topped off by his joke-making, fourth wall breaking, cool jacket-wearing brother befriending you and telling you that Papyrus is a cool dude and not someone you need to worry about. Is Sans lying? Is he an actual friend, a secret enemy? Is this an extended human catching brotherly scheme? I mean, there's no real reason for you to even trust Sans other than he seems like a tight hang. But the eventual choice you make isn't as simple as killing or sparing Papyrus. No, you can end up going on a date with him, where you have a nice time and realize he's just a weird dude who's insecure and doesn't have much going on in his life. He's gotten big into the whole human killing thing just to have some sense of identity and purpose. So clearly sparing this guy is a morally good thing to do, right? Well, is it though? Is it good for you, a child, to convince a skeleton adult to go on a date? A dude whose supposed #1 goal is to capture and kill humans, specifically children, so he can be part of a special human killing power squad run by a king. Is that morally good? Would killing him in self-defense when he attacks you, which he does eventually do, would that be so bad? And what do any of these choices have in the greater context of the plot? It's really hard to say, and not just because, wow, this is morally grey decision making which has complex ideologies at play where anyone could be correct. I mean, maybe a little, but it's mainly difficult to say because it's hard to really even understand the choices you are deciding between. The systems that exist in Undertale are so undefined early on, and how closely they parallel our own is so unclear that it's really impossible to get a bearing of what is morally good or bad in the context of the in-game world. Maybe human killing isn't bad in the world of Undertale. Maybe our decision to walk through the world and just killing ghosts or dogs or skeletons is actually the real evil, and we deserve to be killed for it. But I don't know, and why would I know? And is Undertale trying to help me figure this out? Oh, fuck no. If anything, they're actively trying to make it more difficult for me to get a grasp on what is good and bad. So this leads into the last major theme that throws you off as a player, which is Undertale's general absurdity, its deconstruction of characterization, game mechanics, and world building, all of which make it difficult for you even to center yourself in the logic or the philosophy of the world. A small example of this is after Papyrus has set up a slew of puzzles to impede your progress, he finishes with a crazy difficult one, something that should really test you. There's all these colored blocks which do different things and you need to navigate them to get to the other side. It's entirely overwhelming, and when you ask him to explain it again, he'll do a worse job mixing up some of the rules, really throwing you off. But none of this matters because the puzzle is irrelevant and lands on a sequence that lets you stroll straight through. It's a joke. If you tried to remember the rules, wrote them down, maybe really put in the effort to do this puzzle correctly, then ha ha, what a fool you are. The game is constantly fucking around with what's important and gonna have significant short or long-term consequences, and what is simply a funny gag. Further than this though, Undertale will truly unravel the player's perception of what's important down to the coding and creation of the game. The first major time I experienced this was when I fought Toriel. Not wanting to kill them, I spared them a bunch of times, but not the excessive dozen plus times that was required, and so eventually I just killed them. Instantly regretting my decision, I closed the game, looked online to see if I could spare them, then did the battle again, keeping them alive and getting my hug. When I did this though, the game called me out after the battle. It recognized my actions and told me they knew I had killed Toriel, gone to an earlier save, then spared them the second time around. This was really cool, obviously, but it broke the sacred bond of save states. If the player goes to an old save, the game is supposed to forget everything they did. I didn't even know they could remember. And it gets you questioning, is the game going to hold this over me? Does that choice impact the story in the future? Or is it just letting me know that it knows I cheated, that I went back and changed my narrative? As always, in the early game, you just don't know, but it kept me on edge. The game was holding me accountable in a way that no game has. I wasn't just unsure about the in-game world and all its weirdness, but I wasn't sure what rules the actual game of Undertale was following. And it seemed it was following its own rules that I didn't know, mechanics I couldn't easily understand, systems I couldn't sidestep if I wanted, and all of this really created that ultimate sense of unease. Undertale is a great game, and the way it immediately pushes you off balance and keeps pushing you is one of the most idiosyncratic game styles we've seen from a game. But it's so much more than a design choice. Without it, this would simply be a weird game in a weird world that we'd quickly learn and enjoy for what it is. But the reworking of classic game mechanics and rules we all live and play by means you start the whole experience on the back foot, properly putting you in the mentality of what the actual fuck is going on. The perfect place for you to be so you can properly empathize with your character, a small child who's recently woken up dead in a monster-laden underworld. And that's the video. Thanks for watching, grab some spaghetti, subscribe to the channel for more al dente contente, and check out some of my other videos if you feel so inclined. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!